Alright, chapter 84. After this I saw another dream, and explained it all to thee. My son Enoch arose and said to his son Methuselah, To thee, my son, will I speak, hear my word, and incline thine ear to the visionary dream of thy father. Before I married thy mother Edna, I saw a vision on my bed. And behold, a cow sprung forth from the earth. This cow was white. Afterwards a female heifer sprung forth, and with it another heifer. One of them was black, and one was red. The black heifer then struck the red one, and pursued it over the earth. From that period I could see nothing more of the red heifer, but the black one increased in bulk, and a female heifer came with him. After this I saw that many cows proceeded forth, resembling him and following after him. The first female young one also went out in the presence of the first cow, and sought the red heifer, but found him not. And she lamented with a great lamentation while she was seeking him. Then I looked until that first cow came to her, from which time she became silent and ceased to lament. Afterwards she calved another white cow, and again calved many cows and black heifers. In my sleep also I perceived a white bull, which in like manner grew and became a large white bull. After him many white cows came forth, resembling him, and they began to calve many other white cows, which resembled them all, and followed each other. Again I looked attentively while sleeping, and surveyed heaven above, and behold, a single star fell from heaven, which being raised up ate and fed among those cows. After that I perceived other large and black cows, and behold, all of them changed their stalls and pastures, while their young began to lament one with another. Again I looked in my vision, and surveyed heaven, when behold, I saw many stars, which descended and projected themselves from heaven to where the first star was, into the midst of those young ones, while the cows were with them, feeding in the midst of them. I looked at and observed them, when behold, they all acted after the manner of horses, and began to approach the young cows, all of whom became pregnant, and brought forth elephants, camels, and asses. At these all the cows were alarmed and terrified, when they began biting with their teeth, swallowing and striking with their horns. They began also to devour the cows, and behold, all the children of the earth trembled, shook with terror at them, and suddenly fled away. Again I perceived them when they began to strike and to swallow each other, and the earth cried out. Then I raised my eyes a second time towards heaven, and saw in a vision that, behold, there came forth from heaven, as it were, the likeness of white men. One came forth from thence, and three with him. Those three who came forth last seized me by my hand, and raising me up from the generations of the earth, elevated me to a high station. Then they showed me a lofty tower on the earth, while every hill became diminished, and they said, Remain here until thou perceivest what shall come upon those elephants, camels, and asses, upon the stars, and upon all the cows. Then I looked at that one of the four white men who came forth first. He seized the first star which fell down from heaven, and binding it in hand and foot, he cast it into a valley narrow, deep, stupendous, and gloomy. Then one of them drew his sword and gave it to the elephants, camels, and asses, who began to strike each other, and the whole earth shook on account of them. And when I looked in the vision, behold, one of those four angels who came forth hurled from heaven, collected together, and took all the great stars, whose form partly resembled that of horses, and binding them all hand and foot, cast them into the cavities of the earth. Then one of those four went to the white cows, and taught them a mystery, while the cow was trembling, it was born and became a man, and fabricated for himself a large ship. In this he dwelt, and 3 cows dwelt with him in that ship, which covered them. Again I lifted up my eyes towards heaven, and saw a lofty roof above it, were 7 cataracts, which poured forth on a certain village much water. Again I looked, and behold, there were fountains open on the earth in that large village. The water began to boil up and rose over the earth, so that the village was not seen, while its whole soil was covered with water. Much water was over it, darkness and clouds. Then I surveyed the height of this water, and it was elevated above the village. It flowed over the village and stood higher than the earth. Then all the cows which were collected there, while I looked on them, were drowned, swallowed up, and destroyed in the water. But the ship floated above it. All the cows, the elephants, the camels, and the asses were drowned on the earth, and all cattle. Nor could I perceive them, neither were they able to get out, but perished, and sunk into the deep. Again I looked into the vision, until those cataracts from that lofty roof were removed, and the fountains of the earth became equalized, while other depths were opened, into which the water began to descend, until the dry ground appeared. The ship remained on the earth, the darkness receded, and it became light. Then the white cow, which became a man, went out of the ship, and the 3 cows with him. One of the 3 cows was white, resembling that cow. One of them was red as blood, and one of them was black, and the white cow left them. Then began wild beasts and birds to bring forth. Of all these the different kinds assembled together: lions, tigers, wolves, dogs, wild boars, foxes, rabbits, and the hanzar, the cicet, the avis, kites, the phoenix, the phancas, and ravens. Then a white cow was born in the midst of them, and they began to bite each other, and the white cow, which was born in the midst of them, brought forth a wild ass and a white cow at the same time, and after that many wild asses. Then the white cow which was born brought forth a black wild sow and a white sheep. That wild sow also brought forth many swine, and that sheep brought forth 12 sheep. When those 12 sheep grew up, they delivered one of them to the asses. Again those asses delivered that sheep to the wolves, and he grew up in the midst of them. Then the Lord brought the 11 other sheep, that they might dwell and feed with him in the midst of the wolves. They multiplied, and there was abundance of pasture for them. But the wolves began to frighten and oppress them, while they destroyed their young ones. And they left their young in torrents of deep water. Now the sheep began to cry out on account of their young, and fled for refuge to their Lord. One, however, which was saved, escaped, and went away to the wild asses. I beheld the sheep moaning, crying, and petitioning their Lord with all their might, until the Lord of the sheep descended to their voice, and his lofty habitation went to them and inspected them. He called to that sheep which had secretly stolen away from the wolves, and had told him to make the wolves understand that they were not to touch the sheep. Then that sheep went to the wolves with the word of the Lord, when another met him and proceeded with him. Both of them together entered the dwelling of the wolves, and conversing with them made them understand that from thenceforwards they were not to touch the sheep. Afterwards I perceived the wolves greatly prevailing over the sheep. With their whole force the sheep cried out, and their Lord came to them. He began to strike the wolves, who commenced a grievous lamentation. But the sheep were silent, nor from that time did they cry out. I then looked at them until they departed from the wolves. The eyes of the wolves were blind, who went out and followed them with all their might. But the Lord of the sheep proceeded with them, and conducted them. All his sheep followed him. His countenance was terrific and splendid, and glorious was his aspect. Yet the wolves began to follow the sheep until they overtook them in a certain lake of water. Then that lake became divided, the water standing up on both sides before their face. And while the Lord was conducting them, he placed himself between them and the wolves. The wolves, however, perceived not the sheep, but went into the midst of the lake, following them and running after them into the lake of water. But when they saw the Lord of the sheep, they turned to fly from before his face. Then the water of the lake returned, and that suddenly, according to its nature, it became full, and was raised up, until it covered the wolves. And I saw that all of them which had followed the sheep perished, and were drowned. But the sheep passed over this water, proceeding to a wilderness which was without both water and grass, and they began to open their eaves and to see. I believe that's supposed to say eyes. Then I beheld the Lord of the sheep inspecting them and giving them water and grass. The sheep already mentioned was proceeding with them and conducting them. And when he had ascended the top of a lofty rock, the Lord of the sheep sent him to them. Afterwards I perceived their Lord standing before them, with an aspect terrific and severe. And when they all beheld him, they were frightened at his countenance. All of them were alarmed and trembled. They cried out after the sheep. And to the other sheep who had been with him, and who was in the midst of them, saying, We are not able to stand before our Lord, or to look upon him. Then that sheep who conducted them went away and ascended the top of a rock. When the rest of the sheep began to grow blind, and to wander from the path which he had shown them, but he knew it not. Their Lord, however, was moved with great indignation against them, and when that sheep had learned what had happened, he descended from the top of the rock, and coming to them found that there were many, which had become blind, and had wandered from his path. As soon as they beheld him, they feared and trembled at his presence, and became desirous of returning to their fold. Then that sheep, taking with him other sheep, went to those which had wandered, and afterward began to kill them. They were terrified at his countenance. Then he caused those which had wandered to return, who went back to their fold. I likewise saw there in the vision that this sheep became a man, built a house for the Lord of the sheep, and made them all stand in that house. I perceived also that the sheep which proceeded to meet the sheep, their conductor, died. I saw, too, that all the great sheep perished, while smaller ones rose up in their place, entered into a pasture, and approached a river of water. Then that sheep, their conductor, who became a man, was separated from them and died. All the sheep sought after him and cried for him with bitter lamentation. I saw likewise that they ceased to cry after that sheep, and passed over the river of water, and that there arose other sheep, all of whom conducted them, instead of those who were dead, and who had previously conducted them. Then I saw that the sheep entered into a goodly place, and a territory delectable and glorious. I saw also that they became satiated, and their house was in the midst of a delectable territory, and that sometimes their eyes were open, and that sometimes they were blind. Until another sheep arose and conducted them, he brought them all back, and their eyes were open. Then dogs, foxes, and wild boars began to devour them, until again another sheep arose, the master of the flock, one of themselves, a ram, to conduct them. This ram began to butt on every side those dogs, foxes, and wild boars, until they all perished. But the former sheep opened his eyes and saw that ram in the midst of them, who had laid aside his glory, and he began to strike the sheep, treading upon them and behaving himself without dignity. Then their Lord sent the former sheep again to a still different sheep, and raised him up to be a ram, and to conduct them instead of the sheep who had laid aside his glory. Going therefore to him, and conversing with him alone, he raised up that ram, and made him a prince and leader of the flock, all the time that the dogs troubled the sheep. The first ram paid respect to the latter ram. Then the latter ram arose and fled away from before his face, and I saw that those dogs caused the first ram to fall. But the latter ram arose and conducted the smaller sheep. That ram likewise begat many sheep and died. Then there was a smaller sheep, a ram, instead of him, which became a prince and leader conducting the flock. And the sheep increased in size and multiplied. And all the dogs, foxes, and wild boars feared and fled away from him. That ram also struck and killed all the wild beasts, so that they could not again prevail in the midst of the sheep, nor at any time ever snatch them away. And that house was made large and wide, a lofty tower being built upon it by the sheep, for the Lord of the sheep. The house was low, but the tower was elevated and very high. Then the Lord of the sheep stood upon that tower, and caused a full table to approach before him. Again I saw that those sheep wandered and went various ways, forsaking their house, and that their Lord called to some among them, whom he sent to them. But these the sheep began to kill, and when one of them was saved from slaughter, he leaped and cried out against those who were desirous of killing him. But the Lord of the sheep delivered him from their hands, and made him ascend to him and remain with him. He sent also many others to them to testify, and with lamentations to exclaim against them. Again I saw, when some of them forsook the house of their Lord and his tower, wandering on all sides and growing blind. I saw that the Lord of the sheep made a great slaughter among them in the pasture, until they cried out to him in consequence of that slaughter. Then he departed from the place of his habitation, and left them in the power of lions, tigers, wolves, and the zeeped, and in the power of foxes and of every beast. And the wild beasts began to tear them. I saw too that he forsook the house of their fathers and their tower, giving them all into the power of lions to tear and devour them, into the power of every beast. Then I began to cry out in all my might, imploring the Lord of the sheep, and showing him how the sheep were devoured by all the beasts of prey. But he looked on in silence, rejoicing that they were devoured, swallowed up, and carried off, and leaving them in the power of every beast for food. He called also 70 shepherds, and resigned to them the care of the sheep, that they might overlook them, saying to them and to their associates, every one of you henceforward overlook the sheep, and whatsoever I command you do, and I will deliver them to you numbered. I will tell you which of them shall be slain. These destroy, and he delivered the sheep to them. Then he called to another and said, understand and watch everything which the shepherds shall do to these sheep, for many more of them shall perish than I have commanded. Of every excess and slaughter which the shepherds shall commit, there shall be an account, as how many have perished to my command, and how many they may have been destroyed of their own heads. Of all the destruction brought about by each of the shepherds, there shall be an account, and according to the number I will cause a recital to be made before me, how many they have destroyed of their own heads, and how many they have delivered up to destruction, that I may have this testimony against them, that I may know all their proceedings, and that, delivering the sheep to them, I may see what they will do, whether they will act as I have commanded them or not. Of this, however, they shall be ignorant, neither shalt thou make any explanation to them, neither shalt thou reprove them, but there shall be an account of all the destruction done by them in their respective seasons. Then they began to kill and destroy more than it was commanded them. And they left the sheep in the power of lions, so that very many of them were devoured and swallowed up by lions and tigers, and wild boars preyed upon them. That tower they burnt, and overthrew that house. Then I grieved extremely on account of the tower, and because the house of the sheep was overthrown. Neither was I afterwards able to perceive whether they again entered that house. The shepherds likewise and their associates delivered them to all the wild beasts, that they might devour each of them in his season, according to his number, was delivered up. Each of them, one with another, was described in a book. How many of them, one with another, were destroyed in a book. More, however, than was ordered, every shepherd killed and destroyed. Then I began to weep, and was greatly indignant on account of the sheep. In like manner also I saw in the vision him who wrote, how he wrote down one destroyed by the shepherds. Every day he ascended, remained, and exhibited each of his books to the Lord of the sheep, containing all which they had done, and all which each of them had made away with, and all which they had delivered up unto destruction. And he took the book up in his hands, read it, sealed it, and deposited it. After this I saw shepherds overlooking for 12 hours. And behold, 3 of the sheep departed, arrived, went in, and began building all which was fallen down of that house. But the wild boars hindered them, although they prevailed not. Again they began to build as before. They raised up that tower which was called a lofty tower. And again they began to place before the tower a table with every impure and unclean kind of bread upon it. Moreover also all the sheep were blind, and could not see, as were the shepherds likewise. Thus were they delivered up to the shepherds for a great destruction, who trod them under foot and devoured them. Yet was their Lord silent until all the sheep in the field were destroyed. The shepherds and the sheep were all mixed together, but they did not save them from the power of the beast. Then he who wrote the book ascended, exhibited it, and read it at the residence of the Lord of the sheep. He petitioned him for them and prayed, pointing out every act of the shepherds, and testifying before him against them all. Then, taking the book, he deposited it with him and departed. And I observed during the time that thus 37 shepherds were overlooking, all of whom finished in their respective periods at the first. Others then received them into their hands, that they might overlook them in their respective periods, every shepherd in his own period. Afterwards I saw in the vision that all the birds of heaven arrived, eagles, the avis, kites, and ravens. The eagle instructed them all. They began to devour the sheep, to peck out their eyes, and to eat up their bodies. The sheep then cried out, for their bodies were devoured by the birds. I also cried out and groaned in my sleep against that shepherd which overlooked the flock. And I looked, while the sheep were eaten up by the dogs, by the eagles, and by the kites. They neither left them, their body, nor their skin, nor their muscles, until their bones alone remained, until their bones fell upon the ground, and the sheep became diminished. I observed likewise during the time that 23 shepherds were overlooking, who completed in their respective periods 58 periods. Then were small lambs born of those white sheep, who began to open their eyes and to see, crying out to the sheep. The sheep, however, cried not out to them, neither did they hear what they uttered to them, but were deaf, blind, and obdurate in the greatest degrees. I saw in the vision that ravens flew down upon those lambs, that they seized one of them, and that tearing the sheep in pieces and devoured them. I saw also that great horns grew up those lambs, and that those ravens lighted down upon their horns. I saw too that a large horn sprouted out an animal, among the sheep, and that their eyes were open. He looked at them, their eyes were wide open, and he cried out to them. Then the Debelah saw him, all of whom ran to him. And besides this, all the eagles, the avis, the ravens, and the kites were still carrying of the sheep, flying down upon them and devouring them. The sheep were silent, but the Debelah lamented and cried out. Then the ravens contended and struggled with them. They wished among them to break his horn, but they prevailed not over him. I looked on them until the shepherds, the eagles, the avis, and the kites came, who cried out to the ravens to break the horn of the Debelah, to contend with him and to kill him. But he struggled with them, and cried out, that help might come to him. Then I perceived that the men came who had written down the names of the shepherds, and who ascended up before the Lord of the sheep. He brought assistance, and caused every one of them to see him descending to the help of the Debelah. I perceived likewise that the Lord of the sheep came to them in wrath, while all those who saw him fled away. All fell down in his tabernacle before his face, while all the eagles, the avis, ravens, and kites assembled, and brought with them all the sheep of the field. All came together and strove to break the horn of the Debelah. Then I saw that the man who wrote the book at the word of the Lord opened the book of destruction, of that destruction which the last 12 shepherds wrought, and pointed out before the Lord of the sheep that they were destroyed more than those who preceded them. I saw also that the Lord of the sheep came to them, and taking in his hand the scepter of his wrath, seized the earth, which became rent asunder, while all the beasts and birds of heaven fell from the sheep, and sunk into the earth, which closed over them. I saw too that a large sword was given to the sheep, who went forth against all the beasts of the field to slay them. But all the beasts and birds of heaven fled away from before their face. And I saw a throne erected in a delectable land. Upon this sat the Lord of the sheep, who received all the sealed books, which were opened before him. Then the Lord called the first 7 white ones, and commanded them to bring before him the first of the first stars, which preceded the stars, whose form partly resembled that of horses, the first star which fell down first, and they brought them all before him. And he spoke to the man who wrote in his presence, who was one of the 7 white ones, saying, Take those 70 shepherds, to whom I delivered up the sheep, and who, receiving them, killed more of them than I commanded. Behold, I saw them all bound, and all standing before him. First came on the trial of the stars, which being judged and found guilty went to the place of punishment. They thrust them into a place deep and full of flaming fire, and full of pillars of fire. Then the 70 shepherds were judged, and being found guilty were thrust into the flaming abyss. At that time likewise I perceived that one abyss was thus opened in the midst of the earth, which was full of fire. And to this were brought the blind sheep, which being judged and found guilty were all thrust into that abyss of fire on the earth, and burnt. The abyss was on the right of that house, and I saw the sheep burning, and their bones consuming. I stood beholding him emerge that ancient house, while they brought out its pillars, every plant in it, and the ivory enfolding it. They brought it out and deposited it in a place on the right side of the earth. I also saw that the Lord of the sheep produced a new house, great and loftier than the former, which he bounded by the former circular spot. All its pillars were new, and its ivory new, as well as more abundant than the former ancient ivory which he had brought out. And while all the sheep which were left were in the midst of it, all the beasts of the earth, and all the birds of heaven fell down and worshipped them, petitioning them and obeying them in everything. Then those 3 who were clothed in white, and who holding by my hand had before caused me to ascend, while the hand of him who spoke held me, raised me up, and placed me in the midst of the sheep before the judgment took place. The sheep were all white, with wool long and pure. Then all who had perished and had been destroyed, every beast of the field and every bird of heaven, assembled in that house, while the Lord of the sheep rejoiced with great joy, because all were good and had come back again to his dwelling. And I saw that they laid down the sword which had been given to the sheep, and returning it to his house, sealing it up in the presence of the Lord. And the sheep would have been enclosed in that house, had it been capable of containing them. And the eyes of all were open, gazing on the good one, nor was there one among them who did not behold him. I likewise perceived that the house was large, wide, and extremely full. I saw, too, that a white cow was born, whose horns were great, and that all the beasts of the field and all the birds of heaven were alarmed at him, and entreated with him at all times. Then I saw that the nature of all of them was changed, and that they became white cows, and that the first, who was in the midst of them, spoke, when that word became a large beast, upon the head of which were great and black horns. While the Lord of the sheep rejoiced over them, and over all the cows. I lay down in the midst of them. I awoke and saw the whole. This is the vision which I saw lying down and waking. Then I blessed the Lord of righteousness, and gave glory to him. Afterwards I wept abundantly, nor did my tears cease, so that I became incapable of enduring it. While I was looking on, they flowed on account of what I saw, for all was come and gone by. Every individual circumstance respecting the conduct of mankind was seen by me. And that night I remembered my former dream, and therefore wept and was troubled, because I had seen that vision.